Well, thank you, Diana and team, for hosting all of us and making these great conversations available. I know they've they're very important for all of us, but I know how hard it is to keep this kind of thing going with an online event. So we appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who've stayed up and are able to be here. So, this case study is really the result of worrying that I was doing about some of my graduate students. And so they really are some of my best students. They're pursuing doctoral studies at various stages in their degree plans. And they're avid teachers. That's part of their identity. But we had just, navigated, out of the pandemic, we hoped. And I was just noticing how exhausted they seemed, both in their studies and they always put their best foot forward in their teaching when I saw them. But I felt it had taken its toll. And then I started wondering, well, might this have an impact on their career sustainability? And with the world changing, what might their career sustainability look like? So that's how this started. And so I'll just sort of share with you some very preliminary results. And I actually think this will be something that's ongoing with these particular students. And I've lost my mouse. There it is. So these, as I say, are four doctoral students at the university where I work here in the southern United States. We have about 200 graduate students typically, and about 3/4 of them are international. So, a number of those discussions and papers yesterday were spot on with what our students experience as well. It's very expensive to come and study here in the States. There are visa considerations. But a lot of our students wish to stay on in the States and get work once they graduate. In reality, many of them do not. Many of them do not get jobs. So there's also sort of that undercurrent that's happening the whole time they're with us. So you can see here where these four particular students came from. I really did purposeful sampling here. I really wanted to look just at doctoral students because they are now getting closer to being able to be sent off, if you will, and navigate their way in the world. And presumably they won't come back for further degrees, although sometimes they do. And these four students agreed to participate. They were excited to participate. They all do research themselves. And so, and I think like many young people, they were just kind of happy to have an opportunity to think about their careers and to talk about their lives. And a lot of my work centers on, are we preparing students, for the potential careers they have? But I was also interested in hearing what these students envisioned for their careers, which, sometimes I think, as Nicole helped us remember today, we forget to do. We forget to act like a career counselor when we're mentoring it. And that was an important reminder today. So the students filled out a questionnaire, and that was in part to prime them for some of these topics that we would be discussing in the in-depth interviews. So it really was about resiliency and sustainability. And I will say I liked that these four students were at different stages in their doctoral studies. So it gives us a snapshot. And I think when I just sort of briefly present their cases in a moment, you'll see some of your own students, I think, in these people. But I would consider them to be among our more resilient graduate students that we have here, and certainly with whom I work. So I just thought they would be a nice sample. So I analyzed each individually for emergent themes, and then did a cross-case analysis of sorts, and that's sort of what I'll end with today, just to give us some things perhaps that we could think about moving forward and in our own situations. This is, of course, very context driven, not generalizable. But again, I think we'll see some of you may recognize some of these students in these snapshots. You may recognize them as your students. So the first student, whom I will call Melody, she is a first-year PhD student. Many of the students who come into our PhD program, and Melody is no exception, have undergraduate degrees, sometimes even master's degrees in performance, but we don't have a piano pedagogy degree specifically at the doctoral level. So these are often students who self-identify as teacher. They come in through the PhD program, they want to do research, but they have no performance requirements. And I think that's important. They choose piano pedagogy as their minor, but in essence, it becomes like a double major for these students. This Melody was, she is a foreign student. She earned a performance diploma in her home country, but both her undergraduate degree and her master's degrees were in performance and pedagogy, and they were all done in the US. And that's significant because here in the United States at the undergraduate level, every student is supposed to have one pedagogy degree. Now, that can vary. How that looks varies, to be sure. She has done some teaching throughout her master's. She's teaching concurrently now with her doctoral studies, and had done some teaching. So, not a lot of experience, but about 4.5, 5 years of experience. I was trying to probe a little bit to find out how the pandemic impacted these students. And of course, being an international student, she has yet to go back to visit her family in her home country. So technology was a savior for her. It allowed her to connect. She felt she adapted fairly well to teaching and to having her classes and lessons online during the pandemic. And she lived in a part of the country close to where we live now, and we were not closed for very long, to be frank. So many of us were back in person much earlier than you might expect or think. She self-identifies as a lifelong learner. She's flexible about how her career might look, but she's still at the very early stages. Her ideal career is probably something more like my career, where she's working in academia, maybe doing some pre-college teaching on the side, but much more what we would consider a traditional career. She, her identity really is still very much as a performer and in that sense solo, and a teacher. Maya is also in the first year of her PhD program, but she's a little bit older, still under 40, pursuing the exact same program. Her undergraduate degree was in performance. Her master's was in piano pedagogy. She did both classical and jazz studies. That's something we offer here at this university. So it demonstrates just a little bit of diversity in the styles that she's going to play or is interested in playing and possibly teaching. She has significantly more experience between her master's and her doctoral degrees. She was teaching for 13 years as an independent studio owner, and also teaching adjunct, what we call adjunct at a tertiary institution. She's married and she has 3 young children, and that is significant here. 2 of the students who participated are married. Healthcare is tied to employment here in this country. It becomes very expensive. Daycare becomes very expensive as well. So it is a financial hardship for her to come back to school, but this is for her an important way for career advancement, because she won't be able to move beyond the adjunct level. She felt she adapted very well during the pandemic, and feels she will be very flexible and adaptable throughout her career because she feels she's demonstrated this in the past number of years. She identifies primarily as a teacher, much less as a performer now, simply because of the realities of the past 13 years. So that's been an evolution for her. And she's also something of a leader in our profession, especially in her home state and in her community. So that's important as well. Marco is in the second year of his doctoral program. So he's doing piano performance and piano pedagogy. Both of his previous degrees were from the United States. So again, there's pedagogy in his background. He also does, he double majors in classical and jazz studies. So he's out there gigging. He has a much lighter teaching load on campus so that he can be out performing more within our community. Obviously, during the pandemic, this had a major impact. He was planning to take his work-study year, and he did take it between his master's and the beginning of his doctorate, which he's allowed to do here, but all the gigs he had planned dried up. So he didn't get some of that practical experience that he had hoped for and expected during that time, but he's back to doing that now. He's busy many, many nights and every weekend. So he identifies as a performer, not just solo, but chamber, and again, both jazz and classical. He's a teacher. He actually identifies as an entrepreneur, but outside of music. He's very interested in entrepreneurship, those types of activities, and is quite open to a part of his career not being involved in music per se. I think he may envision that as being a source of income to help him pursue music and performing. And our final vignette here, just our little, to capture our fourth person, is Martha. She's in the fourth year of her PhD program, very close to defending her dissertation. She also did a master's in piano pedagogy. She also taught at the university between the master's and the beginning of her doctoral studies. She's also married, and this is important, I think. I don't, bring it up here in a moment as one of the common themes, but it's important because when there is another partner to consider, obviously, this has an impact on the choices we make in our careers. And even though these two women who are married see them, they see themselves as feminists, and they read a lot of feminist literature, they've made lots of sacrifices career-wise in their relationships. They're both married to other academics, not in musical fields. So it means there has to be that give and take that when we're single, we don't have to worry about necessarily. And I think she sort of epitomized, in one of her statements with the pandemic, she said, well, I got through that. I can get through anything. But what I found with these students is they saw the pandemic more as this sort of finite situation that it's over now. It's not that they don't perceive instability in their careers. They very much do. But I actually believe, and this sort of goes to one of the conversations yesterday about trauma, I'm not sure that either of these four people have processed fully, maybe none of us have yet, sort of the impacts of the pandemic and the impacts that it had on our lives. So that part of the research didn't really yield much from our conversations because they truly felt the pandemic did not really affect their careers any more than it would have anyone else. And you can see the identities here that Martha connects with. So is the last slide I have. Don't worry, we're almost done. So they actually really had strong identities, which is not unexpected. What was a little unexpected is that in their own ways, well, it shouldn't have been unexpected, but it was, because I was looking at, I thought, sustainability and whatever. But this is common during times of transition and change. And obviously, being enrolled in a doctoral program is a transformative time. We've just come from this pandemic. So it presented opportunities for them to really reevaluate their career identities. And they were doing this. They were actively doing this, and will continue to do so for a while. They still derive their creative satisfaction from playing. playing the piano. And so even though for 3 of them, taking lessons it's not part of their degree plan, that's extra, they all do that. And they all spoke about finding time, talking about this balance, trying to find time to rejuvenate in that sense. And it was through playing, not necessarily performing, but playing. They didn't feel that even though they were excellent teachers and displayed creativity, I would argue, in their teaching, they didn't feel that was creatively satisfying necessarily for them. They all displayed great flexibility, and what Dweck would call the growth mindset, which is promising in terms of flexibility as their career path evolves. And they all expect to pursue multiple career paths. Now, it was interesting. None of them identified as being entrepreneurial particularly, and yet they were. They all have websites, and they're all working, and they have many projects going on, and I believe they will as their careers begin, but they really still didn't self-identify with being entrepreneurial. And again, I think any of the effects that they felt from the pandemic, they felt were very personal. And part of this may have to do with that may be a generational thing as well. But there's also this sort of resignation because they recognize, in part, I think because they're foreign students, in part because of the times we're in, the great change that's happening, that they don't have a lot of agency over some of the possibilities in their career. They have agency over certain things, but there's much that is out of their control when it comes to career choice. And so this is part of what they're struggling with, and this is part of what's helping them to reshape their identities. And this instability was such that they did not even want to discuss their career goals with me for even just 5 years down the road. They just felt they could not do that because I think they have goals, don't get me wrong, but they really didn't want to state them in terms of my career will look like this and my portfolio will look such and such. And then I'll just end with, they spoke about practical training and this mentoring, and clearly they've sought out mentors. But again, to go back to the discussion earlier this morning for me, that it's important that we give them space. I actually feel like the time that we were having these interviews was their space to do the career constellation. And I may steal that for, a future portion of work with them, because many of them recognize that the careers their mentors have, that's not how their own careers will look. They still think there's value, but it led to them seeking out different mentors for different parts of their career. So I'm sorry that I have taken all the time, but I appreciate your thoughts. And if we don't have time for questions, please pop them in the chat. I'll be happy to respond.